In a dusty corner of the Colorado Rockies, there was a town called Copper Creek. It was the kind of place that chewed up good men and spit out devils, a place where hope came to die. And on a cold autumn morning, a man named Ezra Hawthorne rode into that town with ghosts in his eyes and the last of his silver in his pocket. He was a mountain man, carved from the rock and silence of the high peaks, and he hadn't come for conversation. He'd come for salt, coffee, and a bottle of whiskey to keep the ghosts quiet. He got his supplies, but the whiskey called to him, a familiar siren song of forgetting. He pushed through the doors of the Broken Wheel Saloon, the air thick with smoke and desperation, and found a spot at the end of the bar. He kept his back to the wall. It was an old habit, one that had saved his life more than once. He was halfway through his second glass when he heard a voice that cut through the noise, a voice slick with whiskey and despair. $20, the man slurred. $20 and she's yours. Ezra's jaw tightened. He'd heard it before. Some poor soul selling off his last possessions. A saddle, a gun, a pocket watch. He kept his eyes on his drink, determined to stay out of it. It wasn't his business. It was never his business. Come on now, the voice pleaded. She's a good girl, strong for her age. She can cook, clean, tend the animals. The words hit Ezra like a bucket of ice water. Slowly he turned. Standing by the poker table was a farmer, swaying on his feet, his face a ruin of broken dreams. But it wasn't the man that made Ezra's blood run cold. It was the small figure standing beside him. A little girl, no more than 8 or 9 years old, thin as a willow switch. Her dress was the color of a winter sky, faded and worn. Her hair was a tangled mess around a face that was all sharp angles and hollow cheeks. She clutched a small bundle to her chest like it was the only thing she had left in the world, which it probably was. The saloon had gone quiet. Men looked away, nursing their drinks, uncomfortable but unwilling to step in. This was the frontier. Poverty was a sickness, and desperate men did desperate things. That's your daughter, Silas, someone muttered. You can't just... Can't what? Silas whirled around, his eyes wild. Can't feed her. Can't keep a roof over her head? You offering to help, Tom? No? Then shut your mouth. Ezra's hand tightened around his glass until his knuckles turned white. The scene blurred, and for a second he wasn't in the Broken Wheel Saloon. He was a boy again, helpless, watching his own father make the same devil's bargain, selling his sister to a stranger to pay off a gambling debt. He remembered the look in her eyes as she was led away, pleading, terrified, betrayed. He'd been too young to stop it then, too weak, too scared. He wasn't scared anymore. I'll take her. The words came out of his mouth before he could stop them, a low growl that silenced the room. Every single head in that saloon turned to stare at the mountain man who barely ever spoke. Silas blinked, trying to focus on him. You! What? Ezra stood up, his tall frame unfolding from the bar stool. He felt like a giant in that small, dirty room. I said, I'll take her. He reached into his coat, pulled out his pouch of silver coins, and counted them out onto the bar with slow, deliberate clicks. $20. Nearly every cent he had. Enough for a horse. Enough for a man to sell his soul and ride away from the crime. A grotesque smile spread across Silas's face. Well now, seems we got a deal, Mr. Hawthorne. He grabbed the girl's shoulder, shaking her. You hear that, Emma? This man's going to take care of you now. You be good for him. The girl, Emma, finally looked up. Her eyes were the color of a deep mountain lake, and they were filled with a pain that no child should ever know. She looked at her father, then at Ezra, and then back to her father. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. Silas shoved her forward. Here, she's yours. The transaction was done. Silas snatched the money from the bar and practically ran for the door, stumbling in his haste to escape what he'd just done. He didn't look back, not even once. And Ezra was left standing there, the weight of his actions crashing down on him. He had acted on instinct, on a rage he thought he'd buried years ago. Now a child stood before him, a child with haunted eyes, and he had no idea what to do next. Come on, he said, his voice rusty from disuse. He turned and walked out, not checking to see if she followed. A moment later, he heard the soft shuffle of her worn-out shoes on the sawdust behind him. Outside, the sun was too bright. It felt wrong, like the world should be as dark and ugly as what had just happened. Ezra loaded his supplies onto his mule. Bessie, every movement stiff. He was painfully aware of the small girl standing a few feet away, watching him, her body tense as a bowstring. What in God's name had he done? He could barely take care of himself. His cabin was no place for a child. He should take her to the church, leave her with the reverend, let them find a proper family for her. But when he looked at her, at the way she stood, poised to run at any second, he knew he couldn't. The world had failed this child. Her father had failed her. The whole town had failed her. He wouldn't be another name on that list. "You ever ridden a mule?" he asked. She just shook her head, her eyes fixed on the ground. "Well, come on then. It's a long walk, and we need to make it back before dark." He lifted her onto the mule's back. She was so light, she felt like a bundle of sticks. She sat stiffly on the saddle, terrified of falling, but too scared or too proud to say anything. "Hold on to the saddle horn," he said, adjusting the supplies around her. "Bessie's steady. She won't let you fall." They left Copper Creek behind, a man, a child, and a mule, making their slow way up the mountain path as the shadows grew long. Ezra walked in front, leading Bessie by the rope. Emma rode in silence, her small hands clutching the saddle horn so tight her knuckles were white. The first mile passed without a single word. Then the second. It wasn't until they stopped for water at a small spring that Ezra realized he had no idea how to talk to a child. His own daughter, Sarah, had been just a baby when the fever took her. This girl was older, harder, shaped by a life he couldn't even imagine. "There's water," he said, gesturing to the spring. She slid down from the mule and went to the water's edge like a cautious deer. She cupped her hands and drank, then splashed her face. When she was done, she came back and stood by the mule, still clutching that little cloth bundle. "What's in there?" Ezra asked, nodding at it. For a second, he thought she wouldn't answer. Then, in a voice so quiet it was barely a whisper, she said, "My mama's handkerchief, and a piece of cornbread." The words hit him in the gut. "When did you eat last?" She just shrugged, a small, heartbreaking gesture that told him everything he needed to know. He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a piece of dried jerky. It wasn't much, but it was all he had. "Here." She took it from him hesitantly, like she expected him to snatch it back. When he didn't, she took a small bite, chewing slowly, making it last. They kept moving up the mountain as the sun dipped behind the peaks. The air grew cold fast. Ezra saw her shivering, and without a word, he took off his thick coat and draped it over her small shoulders. It swallowed her whole, hanging down past the mule's belly, but it would keep her warm. The trail got steeper, more dangerous. His mind was racing. What had he done? He'd failed his own family. How could he possibly care for this child? But every time the doubt crept in, he saw his sister's face. He remembered standing there, frozen, as she was led away. He remembered finding her body in a Denver brothel 3 years later, destroyed by disease and despair. He wouldn't let that happen again. Not to this girl, not while he was alive. Just as the last light of day painted the sky crimson, the cabin came into view. It looked smaller than usual, a lonely little box against the vast empty mountains. "This is it," Ezra said, helping her down from the mule. "Home." She stood there, his coat pooled around her feet, and looked at the cabin with those unreadable blue eyes. Then she clutched her bundle and took one small step toward the door. It wasn't trust, not yet, but it was a start. And as they stepped inside, neither of them knew that their journey had only just begun. The quiet of the mountain was about to be shattered by a danger neither of them saw coming. The inside of the cabin was one single room, shaped by 5 years of solitude. A stone fireplace stood against one wall, a rough-hewn table and 2 chairs in one corner, a narrow bed in the other. It was the home of a man who had forgotten how to live with anyone but ghosts. Ezra moved with quiet efficiency, starting a fire in the hearth. As the flames caught and warmth began to push back the cold, he watched the girl. She stood just inside the door, still wrapped in his giant coat, her eyes following his every move. She looked like a trapped animal, ready to bolt at the first sign of danger. "You can sit," he said, gesturing to a chair. I'll make us something to eat." She perched on the very edge of the seat, her bundle still clutched to her chest. Ezra's supplies were basic: salt pork, beans, hardtack. He started cooking, the simple, familiar task calming his nerves. He knew how to do this. This didn't require complicated words or feelings. He served up the food on 2 tin plates, giving her the bigger portion without a word. She just stared at it, as if she'd never seen so much food in one place. "Go on," he said gruffly. "It's not much, but it'll fill you up." She ate slowly, taking small bites, her eyes darting up at him between mouthfuls. He could see she was expecting him to take it away from her at any moment. He wondered how many days it had been since she'd eaten a real meal. When she finished her plate, he scraped half of his own portion onto it. She looked up at him, and for the first time, he saw a flicker of something in her eyes. It wasn't gratitude. It was pure, raw surprise. After they ate, he cleared the plates. The wind was picking up outside, howling like a lost soul. He had to figure out where she would sleep. There was only one bed. "You'll take the bed," he said, his voice loud in the quiet room. "I'll make a pallet by the fire." He started gathering blankets, trying to make a comfortable spot for himself on the hard floor. When he turned back, she wasn't in the chair anymore. She was pressed into the far corner of the cabin, her bundle held tight, trembling. But it wasn't from the cold this time. In the flickering firelight, he saw the look on her face. It was raw, absolute terror. And then it hit him like a punch to the stomach. Of course she was afraid. Her own father had sold her to a stranger, a big, rough mountain man who'd brought her to an isolated cabin miles from anywhere. In her mind, she knew what happened next. Ezra felt sick. He slowly lowered himself to the floor, trying to make himself look smaller, less threatening. "Emma," he said, his voice quiet, "I need you to listen to me. I'm not going to hurt you. Do you understand? Not ever. You're safe here." She stayed pressed against the wall, but her eyes were locked on his, searching his face. "I had a daughter once," he said, the words tearing out of him. "Her name was Sarah. She was just a baby when she died. Her and her mother. The fever took them both, 5 winters ago." He had never spoken those words to another living soul, but this terrified child in his cabin deserved the truth. "I bought you from your pa because I couldn't stand to watch what he was doing. No child should be sold like an animal. I don't want anything from you. I just want to see you fed and safe. That's all." The silence stretched out, thick and heavy. Then in a voice so small he almost missed it, she asked the question that shattered him. "Are you going to sell me like Papa did?" The words broke him. A dam inside him that had held for 5 long years burst and he started to cry. Not quiet tears, but great, ragged, gasping sobs he couldn't control. He turned his face away, ashamed, but the grief poured out of him. "No," he choked out between sobs. "Never. You hear me? Never." When he finally got control of himself, wiping his eyes with the back of his rough hand, he saw that she had moved away from the wall. Still cautious, but something in her had shifted. "You can have the bed," she whispered. "No, it's yours. I've slept on harder ground than this." I I usually sleep in the barn," she said, her voice barely audible. "With the animals. When Papa remembered to unlock the door." The cruelty of it stole his breath. What kind of man locks his own child in a barn? "You will never sleep in a barn again," he said, his voice shaking with a rage he didn't know he still had. "The bed is yours, every night. You'll be warm, and you'll be safe." She crept towards the bed as if it were a wild animal that might bite her. She touched the blanket reverently, like she'd never felt anything so soft. "I'll be right here by the fire," he said. "The door's barred. Nobody can get in. You can sleep." She climbed into the bed, fully dressed, still clutching her bundle. She lay there stiff as a board, staring at the ceiling. The fire burned low. Outside, the wind howled, and somewhere in the distance, a wolf called to its pack. Emma flinched at the sound. "Just wolves," Ezra said. "They don't come near the cabin. Papa said wolves would eat me if I ran away." "Your papa said a lot of things that weren't true." A moment passed. "My mama died 2 summers ago," she whispered into the darkness. "Papa said it was my fault. Said I ate too much. and she worked herself to death trying to feed me. Ezra's hands clenched into fists. That's a lie, Emma. Whatever happened to your mama, it wasn't your fault. Some men, they just need someone to blame for their own failures. He wasn't always mean, she said, a heartbreaking defense of the man who sold her. Once, once he carved me a wooden horse. She was quiet for a long time, and he thought she'd fallen asleep. Then she asked, "What was your girl like? Sarah?" The question took him by surprise. She was bright, like sunshine, laughed at everything. She had these tiny little hands, he said, holding up his own massive one. Could wrap her whole fist right around my finger, held on so tight. Did you sing to her? Her mama did. Mary. She had a voice like a bird. My mama sang too, Emma whispered. In the sweet by and by. Do you know that one? Ezra nodded in the darkness. I know it. Could you? Would you? I don't sing, child. My voice would scare the coyotes. A tiny sound escaped her, not quite a laugh, but the closest thing he'd heard. Maybe. Just say the words. He stared into the dying embers of the fire, the memories flooding back. Mary singing as she kneaded bread. Sarah gurgling on a blanket nearby, a lifetime ago. There's a land that is fairer than day, he began, his voice rough and low, and by faith we can see it afar. He spoke the verses he remembered, a promise whispered into the dark, lonely cabin. Sometime during the second verse, her breathing evened out. By the third, she was fast asleep. Ezra lay awake for hours listening. He had acted on ghosts and guilt, and now he had a living, breathing child in his bed. He didn't know how to be what she needed, but he would learn. He had failed his own family. He would not fail this girl. As snow began to fall outside, blanketing the world in a quiet white, he kept watch. One of them had finally found safety. The other had just found a reason to live. But what neither of them knew was that Silas hadn't just been a drunk. He'd been a man in deep, dangerous debt, and the man he owed money to was about to come looking for his property. The first snows of winter gave way to the spring thaw, and life in the small cabin found a new rhythm. The awkward arrangement between a grieving man and a terrified child, slowly, carefully, began to feel like a family. Emma was a fast learner. She grew stronger carrying water from the stream. She learned to bank the fire at night. She learned to split kindling with a small hatchet, a rare smile gracing her face when the wood split clean. But Ezra was teaching her more than just chores. He was teaching her how to survive. He taught her to read the clouds, to smell a coming storm on the wind. He showed her how to read the tracks in the mud near the stream. Mountain cat, he'd say, kneeling down. Female. Probably has kittens nearby. See how she's moving careful? Mothers with young ones to feed don't take big risks. Emma absorbed every lesson with a fierce intensity. For her, knowledge wasn't for a schoolhouse. It was for staying alive. Slowly, she began to come out of her shell. The fear that had clung to her like a shroud started to fall away. She began asking questions. Why do you live up here all alone? She asked one night. Ezra thought for a moment. Wasn't always alone, he said, his voice quiet. After my family died, the town felt too crowded. Too many ghosts. The mountains. They don't ask questions. They just demand an honest day's work. Do you miss them? She asked. Every day. She nodded. I missed my mama, but not Papa. Is that wrong? No, child, it's not wrong. We miss the people who were kind to us. That's all. But Ezra knew kindness wasn't enough to keep her safe. The world was full of men like Silas, and worse. So he began to teach her how to fight. He showed her how to handle a knife, how to use her small size as a weapon. A big man expects you to fight straight on, he explained. But you're small, you're quick. Go for the knees, the eyes, the throat. Then you run. You always run. You get back to this cabin, you bar the door, and you don't open it for anyone but me. He gave her a small knife of her own, good steel with a bone handle that fit her hand perfectly. She treated it with a reverence most girls save for dolls. The most important lessons were with the rifle. He had a small .22 caliber, and at first it was heavy and awkward in her hands. But she was determined. Steady, he'd coach her, as she aimed at a piece of bark he'd nailed to a tree. Breathe out slow. Squeeze the trigger. Don't jerk it. The first shot went wide, but she didn't flinch. By the end of the summer, she could hit the center of the target more often than not. She even brought down a rabbit for their dinner, her face a mixture of pride and sadness. It's all right to feel sorry for it, he told her. Shows you have a good heart. But out here, we take what we need to survive. We waste nothing. That's how we honor the life that was given to keep us alive. He also showed her the secret places of the mountain, a hidden cave behind a waterfall, a hollowed-out log that looked solid from the outside, a network of rock formations that created natural shelters. In each spot, he stashed a small supply of dried food, a blanket, and ammunition. If someone comes when I'm not here, he told her, his voice grim, and you can't get to the cabin, you run to one of these places. You hide and you wait for me. You understand? She nodded, her eyes serious. She knew this wasn't a game. The real test came on a crisp autumn afternoon. Ezra was checking his trap lines a few miles from the cabin. He'd only been gone for a couple of hours when he heard it. The single sharp crack of the Suck 22 rifle echoing through the mountains. Fear, cold and sharp, shot through him. He ran. He ran faster than he'd run in years, his mind flashing with a dozen terrible possibilities. He burst into the clearing around the cabin, his own rifle raised, his heart hammering against his ribs, and he found Emma standing on the porch, the smoking .22 in her hands. A large black bear was crashing away through the underbrush, surprised and angry. It was trying to get into the root cellar, she said. Her voice was steady, but he could see her hands were trembling. I remembered what you said. Fire a shot over its head first, to scare it off. Ezra's knees felt weak with relief. You did good, Emma, he said, his voice rough with emotion. You did real good. That night she sat a little closer to the fire than usual. I was scared, she admitted quietly. You'd be a fool not to be, he said. But you kept your head. You did what you had to do. That's what matters. Would you have shot it if it hadn't run away? If it threatened you, he said, looking her straight in the eye, I would have shot it without a second's thought. A new understanding passed between them. The mountains were beautiful, but they were not kind. And sometimes you had to be unkind to protect what mattered. And somewhere along the way, without either of them ever saying it, they had become what mattered to each other. As the days grew shorter, Ezra watched her. The haunted look was still there in her eyes, but now it was joined by something else. Confidence. Purpose. He saw her one evening, staring at the sky. Storm's coming, she said, reading the clouds as well as he could. A big one. He felt a warmth spread through his chest. Then we'd best get ready. The storm hit that night with a fury that shook the very logs of the cabin. But inside they were safe. They were warm. They were together. And for two people who had known nothing but cold and loneliness, that was everything. But while they found peace in their isolation, down in Copper Creek, whispers were starting to spread. Whispers about the mountain man and the child he'd bought. And a man named Isaac Hartley, a man who considered himself the town's moral compass, was starting to listen. The storm outside was nothing compared to the one that was about to break over their heads. The knock on the door came at dawn. It was sharp, loud, and held the weight of authority. Ezra was already awake. Mountain life taught a man to sleep with one ear open. Emma, he said quietly, touching her shoulder. Get dressed. We have company. She was awake in an instant, her eyes immediately going to the rifle by the door. Ezra shook his head. Not that kind of trouble, he said, but stay back. He opened the door to find Sheriff Tom Garrett on his porch, but he wasn't alone. With him were two men from town, Claude Morrison, who ran the general store, and Isaac Hartley, a man whose face was pinched with self-righteousness. Sheriff, Ezra said, his body blocking the doorway. It's a little early for a social call. This isn't social, Hawthorne, Garrett said, looking uncomfortable. We've had some complaints, concerns about the girl's welfare. Hartley pushed forward, his face red with anger. You know damn well why we're here. That girl... Careful. Ezra's voice dropped, low and dangerous. You choose your next words real careful, Hartley. The sheriff put a hand on Hartley's arm. People are talking, Hawthorne. A man living alone up here with a young girl. No relation. It doesn't look right. And what would look right to you, Morrison? Ezra asked, his eyes locking on the storekeeper. Leaving her with a father who sold her for $20? Maybe you'd have preferred she ended up with one of the other drunks in that saloon. That's not the point, Hartley sputtered. Isn't it? Ezra shot back. It wasn't your problem when her father was letting her starve, was it? It wasn't your problem when he was locking her in a barn at night. But now that she's fed, clothed, and safe, suddenly you're all concerned citizens. Just then, Emma appeared at his elbow. She was dressed, but her feet were bare, and her small face was set in a stubborn line. I want to stay here, she said, her voice clear and strong. Mr. Hawthorne takes good care of me. Hartley's eyes narrowed. Of course you'd say that. He's probably threatened you. The words died in his throat as Ezra took a single menacing step forward. The sheriff quickly stepped between them. Nobody's accusing anyone of anything, he said. But we have to check. It's my job. Is the girl healthy? Is she getting enough to eat? I eat better than I ever have, Emma said before Ezra could answer. 3 meals a day. And meat most days. And is he teaching you your letters? Emma disappeared into the cabin and came back with a slate. On it were carefully formed letters and simple math problems. We do lessons every evening, she said. I can read from the Bible, and he's teaching me how to do accounts. Morrison took the slate, his eyebrows shooting up in surprise. This is good work, better than my own boys. And the sleeping arrangements? Hartley pressed, unwilling to give up. Ezra's jaw tightened, but Emma answered calmly. I have my own bed. Mr. Hawthorne sleeps on a pallet by the fire. He's never... She paused, then lifted her chin, her voice ringing with a truth that silenced them all. He's never been anything but kind. The first night I was here, I was scared. He told me about his own daughter who died, and he cried. The confession hung in the cold morning air. Men like Ezra Hawthorne didn't cry. The idea that this child had seen him do so seemed to change everything. At Emma's suggestion, they inspected the rest of the homestead. They saw the clean cabin, the well-stocked root cellar, the impressive groupings of her shots on the practice targets outside. Sheriff Garrett let out a low whistle. That's some fine shooting. She's a natural, Ezra said, a flicker of pride in his voice. Even Morrison had to admit it. You've done well by her, Hawthorne. I can see that. But Hartley was like a dog with a bone. It's still not proper. A girl needs a woman's influence. She needs to be in school with other children. Come spring, when the trail is clear, I'll bring her down for schooling, Ezra said, surprising even Emma. But the other children will learn to treat her with respect, or they'll answer to me. The sheriff nodded, satisfied. That's all I needed to hear. He turned to Hartley. Unless you have evidence of actual wrongdoing, Isaac, not just your own sour opinions, I see no reason to interfere here. This isn't over, Hartley snarled as they left. That child belongs in a proper Christian home. Tell me, Hartley, Ezra's voice was deadly quiet. Where was your Christian charity when her father was selling her in a saloon? Where was your proper home then? Hartley flushed and hurried to his horse. After they were gone, Emma leaned against him. What if they try to take me away? Then they'll have to go through me, he said, and I'm not an easy man to go through. She managed a small smile. I know. That's why I told them you cried, so they would know you aren't just tough. You're good. The visit was a warning. Ezra knew it was far from over. Hartley's hatred was a poison that would continue to spread through the town. But what Ezra didn't know was that Hartley wasn't just acting on his own twisted morals. He was being quietly encouraged by another man, a man who had just returned to Copper Creek, a man who believed Emma belonged to him. His name was Jake Sullivan. Winter came down on the mountain like a hammer. Snow piled up in drifts that reached the cabin's windows, cutting them off completely from the world below. Their food stores, meant for one, were stretched thin for two. The real cold set in, and with it, the wolves. Driven by hunger, they grew bold, their howls circling the cabin each night, closer and closer. One night, Ezra woke to the sound of scratching at the door, followed by low, menacing growls. Through the window, he saw at least 8 pairs of yellow eyes glowing in the moonlight. "Stay in bed," he told Emma, reaching for his rifle. But she was already up, her own small rifle in hand. "I can help." Just then, a heavy body slammed against the door, making the wooden bar rattle in its brackets. Another wolf was on the roof, tearing at the shingles. "All right," Ezra said grimly, "but you do exactly as I say." They stood at opposite windows, and on his count, they fired into the air. The wolves scattered, but they didn't go far. They regrouped at the edge of the clearing, pacing, waiting. "They'll be back," Ezra said. The next few days were a siege. Ezra would make desperate runs to the woodpile for more fuel, while Emma stood guard on the porch. Once a large wolf charged him, its teeth bared. A shot from Emma's rifle kicked up snow right in front of its nose, sending it veering off at the last second. "Good shooting," he panted when he got back inside. "Steady under pressure." But the wood was running low, and so was the food. Then a blizzard hit, a screaming wall of wind and snow that threatened to tear the cabin apart. They huddled by the fire, wrapped in every blanket they owned. "Tell me about spring," Emma whispered, her teeth chattering. So he told her stories of wildflowers and warm sunshine, painting a picture of a world that seemed a million miles away. The storm finally passed, leaving behind a world buried in white. They had to dig their way out. The work was exhausting, but they were alive. That night, over a meager supper of rabbit stew, she asked him, "Were you scared? During the storm?" He wanted to lie, to be the strong, fearless man she saw him as. But she deserved the truth. "Yes," he said, "not for me. For you. I have something to lose now." "I was scared too," she admitted. "Not of the wolves. I was scared of losing this, of something happening to you and being all alone again." He reached across the table and took her hand. "As long as I have breath in my body, you have a home here." The weeks that followed tested them both. The food dwindled. They went from 2 meals a day to 1. Ezra gave most of it to Emma, ignoring her protests. His strength began to fail. One morning, checking his empty trap lines, the world went black, and he collapsed face down in the snow. He would have frozen to death right there if Emma hadn't followed him. She had seen how weak he was getting. Somehow, that small, determined girl dragged him back to the cabin. For 2 days, as the snow fell, she nursed him, forcing warm pine needle tea between his lips, feeding him the last of their food while her own stomach growled. When his fever finally broke, he found her asleep on the floor beside him, her own thin coat her only covering, having used all the blankets to keep him warm. She had saved his life. When spring finally arrived, it felt like a resurrection. They had survived. They had faced down the mountain's fury and won. But their greatest test was yet to come. Because as the trails to Copper Creek cleared, Ezra made his first trip to town. And that's when he heard the name, Jake Sullivan. "He's back," Morrison, the storekeeper, told him, his voice low. "Been asking questions. Says he had a deal with Silas Kane before you came along. Says Kane owed him money and promised him the girl as payment. He's telling everyone you stole what was rightfully his." Ezra felt a cold dread creep into his heart. He remembered Sullivan, a weasel of a man who dealt in shady goods and broken promises. He left town immediately. He found Emma on the porch, enjoying the sun. He told her everything, and watched the color drain from her face. "I won't let him near you," he said, "but if you see him coming, you run to the caves, you hide." But Sullivan didn't come to the cabin. He was smarter than that. A few days later, a different group of visitors arrived. It was the town reverend, with 2 councilmen. "Mr. Hawthorne," the reverend said, avoiding his eyes, "Mr. Sullivan has made a formal complaint. He claims to have witnesses that Silas Kane promised him the girl as payment for a debt. He's demanding a hearing to determine her legal guardianship." "Legal?" Ezra's voice was a low growl. "You're calling the sale of a child legal?" "The law on the frontier recognizes certain arrangements," one of the men said. "Indenture. Apprenticeship." "You mean slavery," Ezra spat. "If you refuse the hearing," the man continued, "we'll be forced to involve the territorial marshal. Nobody wants that." The threat was clear. A territorial court wouldn't care about right and wrong, only about contracts and paper. They were trapped. "Saturday," the reverend said, "at the church. Bring the girl. They'll want to hear from her. After they left, Emma dissolved into tears. I won't go with him, she cried. I'll run away. I'll live in the mountains. No, Ezra said, kneeling in front of her. We face this together. Running will only make us look guilty. We've done nothing wrong. But what if they believe him? Then we'll deal with it, he said, a grim look on his face. But I have a feeling Mr. Sullivan isn't nearly as clever as he thinks he is. He was right. Sullivan had made a critical mistake. He had underestimated the girl he was trying to claim. The church was packed. It felt less like a hearing and more like a public spectacle. Jake Sullivan sat in the front row, smug and confident, in a new suit that didn't quite fit. He stood and told his story, a neat and tidy lie about a business debt and an agreement with Silas Kane. He even had two rough-looking men in the back who swore they'd witnessed the whole thing. Then it was Ezra's turn. He told the simple truth of what had happened in the saloon. Sullivan just laughed. He was trying to cheat me, selling the same goods twice. Goods? A small, clear voice cut through the tension. Every eye in the church turned to Emma. Is that what I am? Goods? The Reverend, looking troubled, called her forward. She walked to the front, her back straight, and looked directly at Jake Sullivan. And for the first time, a flicker of unease crossed his face. I know you, she said, her voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the room. You used to come to our farm. You brought Papa whiskey. You filled his head with stories about getting rich. She looked at the crowd. You're the reason he started drinking so much. You gave him credit for goods to sell, but the goods were rotten. Weevily flour and watered-down whiskey. When he couldn't pay, you started coming around more. You started looking at me. The room was dead silent. You told him how useful a girl my age could be. How I was pretty enough to fetch a good price in one of those houses in Denver. A collective gasp went through the church. Several women pulled their children closer. She's lying, Sullivan sputtered, his face turning purple. The day Mr. Hawthorne bought me, Emma said, tears now streaming down her face, I was glad, because he was a stranger. But you, Mr. Sullivan, I knew exactly what you wanted. Prove it, Sullivan screamed. It's your word against mine. You can't prove a thing. I can. The voice came from the back of the church. The crowd parted as Sheriff Garrett walked in. He wasn't alone. With him was a woman, a stranger, her face etched with grief and a cold, hard anger. This is Mrs. Margaret Foster from Denver, the sheriff announced. She has something to say. Mrs. Foster looked at Jake Sullivan with pure hatred. 3 years ago, she said, her voice shaking, that man sold me my daughter. He told me she was an orphan who needed a good home. I found out later he'd bought her from her own father for a case of whiskey. He promised her father she'd have a better life. Where is she now? Someone asked. Mrs. Foster's voice broke. She's dead. She took sick last winter. But before she died, she told me everything. About the promises Mr. Sullivan made, and about what he really intended to do with her. The church exploded into chaos. Sullivan's two witnesses, seeing the tide turn, quickly changed their story, claiming they'd misremembered everything. Sullivan lunged at them, screaming curses, before being restrained by a half-dozen angry men. The Reverend raised his hand for silence. All in favor of maintaining Mr. Hawthorne's guardianship, he called out. Every hand in the room went up. And all in favor of running Mr. Sullivan out of town on the next rail. The same hands went up, this time with a roar of approval. As Sullivan was dragged out of the church, still screaming threats, Emma ran to Ezra and threw her arms around his waist, burying her face in his shirt. How did you know? She whispered. Your papa here is a smart man, Sheriff Garrett said, clapping Ezra on the back. He came to me as soon as he heard Sullivan was in town. We sent a few telegrams. Turns out Mrs. Foster has been looking for this piece of trash for over a year. As they left the church, the townspeople who had once whispered about them now nodded in respect. Mrs. Patterson from the dress shop pressed a bag of peppermint sticks into Emma's hand. Out in the sunshine, she looked up at Ezra. Thank you, she said, for fighting for me, for being my papa. It was the first time she had ever called him that. The word hit him with the force of a physical blow, and he had to clear his throat twice before he could speak. "Come on, Papa's girl," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Let's go home." They walked up the mountain path, no longer a hermit and his purchased child, but a father and a daughter. They had won, but their victory had sent ripples all the way to the territorial capital. And a circuit judge, a man who cared far more for the letter of the law than for the matters of the heart, was about to bring the full weight of that law down upon them. The Copper Creek Courthouse was an imposing brick building, and on that hot July morning, it felt like a prison. The formal hearing was before Judge Samuel Thornton, a man known for his cold, strict adherence to the law. A special prosecutor had even come from the territorial capital. This was no longer about what was right, it was about what was legal. "You claim guardianship, Mr. Hawthorne," the judge said, peering over his spectacles. "On what grounds?" "On the grounds that I have cared for her, protected her, and raised her as my own," Ezra said, his voice steady. "I see here that you paid $20 for the child," the judge continued. "Do you have a receipt for this transaction?" "There was no receipt. It was not that kind of transaction." "Then you have no proof of a legal exchange. The buying and selling of human beings, Mr. Hawthorne, is illegal." The prosecutor stood. "Your Honor, the territory's position is that Mr. Hawthorne has no legal claim to this child. We propose she be placed in the territorial orphanage until a suitable family can be found." "No!" Emma cried out from her seat in the gallery. "I want to stay with my papa." The judge's gavel slammed down. "The child will be silent." Sheriff Garrett spoke up for Ezra's character. Mrs. Patterson testified about the clothes he'd bought for Emma. But the prosecutor twisted everything. When the sheriff mentioned Ezra had taught Emma to use a rifle, the prosecutor pounced. "Or perhaps he's training her for a life of crime. A mountain bandit needs accomplices." "You dare!" Ezra roared, surging to his feet before his lawyer pulled him back down. Then a voice came from the back of the courtroom. "Your Honor, I request permission to speak." A well-dressed woman and her husband, a doctor from Denver, came forward. They introduced themselves as Catherine and Marcus Webb. "Your Honor," Mrs. Webb began, 23 years ago, my own daughter was taken from our home and sold. We have spent our lives searching for her, and in doing so, we have uncovered a vast network of men like Jake Sullivan, who traffic in children under the guise of apprenticeship. We investigated this case. We found 3 other girls Sullivan had purchased. None of them survived their first year in his care. A gasp went through the courtroom. Furthermore, her husband added, if this court deems Mr. Hawthorne unsuitable, we formally petition to take guardianship of Emma ourselves. No! Emma was on her feet again, tears streaming down her face. He's my papa. He saved me. She looked at the judge, her eyes pleading. Please, Your Honor. You've heard from everyone else. Don't I get a say in my own life? Judge Thornton stared at her for a long, silent moment. Then he nodded. Approach the bench, child. Emma walked forward, her small body trembling, but her voice was strong. Your Honor, my real father sold me for whiskey money. But Papa Hawthorne, he gave up almost everything he had to buy me. Not because he wanted a servant, but because he couldn't stand to see a child being sold. He taught me to read and write. He taught me to be brave. Last winter, he went hungry so that I could eat. He cried when I asked him if he would sell me too. He stood between me and a pack of wolves. He's the only real family I have ever known. My birth father gave me away. Mr. Hawthorne fought to keep me. Which one of them deserves to be called Papa? She turned to the Webbs. Thank you for your offer, but I already have a home. If the law says that love and a home aren't enough, if papers matter more than a family, then the law is wrong. And I will run away from any orphanage you send me to. I will run back to the mountains. I will run back to my papa. Every single time. The courtroom was utterly silent. Judge Thornton slowly took off his spectacles and polished them. He looked at Ezra. Mr. Hawthorne, by every standard metric of the law, you are an unsuitable guardian. You are unmarried, you live in isolation, and you have no legal documentation for this child. Ezra's heart sank. However, the judge continued, the law also recognizes that the welfare of the child is the most important thing. This child is healthy, educated, and has shown a courage and eloquence beyond her years. It is the judgment of this court, he said, raising his gavel, that Ezra Hawthorne be granted full and permanent legal guardianship of the child Emma. This court further orders the creation of proper adoption papers, making her his daughter, legally and forever. The courtroom erupted in cheers. Emma flew into Ezra's arms, sobbing with relief. As they left the courthouse, the official papers clutched in her hand like a holy relic. Sheriff Garrett clapped Ezra on the shoulder. "Justice won today," he said. Ezra looked down at the smiling, tear-streaked face of his daughter. "No," he said. "Family won." They headed for the mountain trail, back to their cabin, their home. Father and daughter, in the eyes of God, the town, and now the law. 2 years passed, 2 years of peaceful seasons on the mountain. Emma was 11 now, growing tall and strong, the last traces of the haunted child replaced by a quiet confidence. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, she broke the silence. "Papa, tell me about Mama Mary and Sarah again." The stories of the family he had lost were no longer just his. They were hers too, a bridge connecting her to a past filled with love. He told her about Mary's biscuits and her singing voice, about baby Sarah chasing a butterfly across the cabin floor. "They would have loved you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Life had settled into a comfortable rhythm, but Ezra saw a new light in Emma's eyes. She was talking about helping the school teacher in town, about helping other children who were lost and scared, like she had been. His little girl was growing up, her heart expanding beyond their mountain sanctuary. He felt a pang of fear, the selfish desire to keep her safe with him forever, but he also felt a deep, swelling pride. He had raised her to be strong. He couldn't clip her wings now. That night a knock came at the door. It was Sheriff Garrett, his face grim. "It's about Silas Kane," he said. "Your birth father. They found him." He froze to death outside a mining camp. He handed Emma a worn, dirty envelope. "He was carrying this. It's addressed to you." Her hands trembled as she took the letter. After the sheriff left, she sat with it on the table between them for a long time. Finally, she opened it. The writing inside was a shaky, barely legible scrawl. "Emma, girl," it read, "I know I got no right. What I done was unforgivable. I was a coward and a drunk, and I sold my own blood for a bottle. I hear you're with that mountain man. I hear he's raising you proper. That's good. Better than I could have done. I pray you can forgive me, but I don't blame you if you can't. I can't forgive myself. Tell Hawthorne thank you for being the father I should have been. You're no good papa, Silas." Emma was sobbing, and Ezra pulled her into a tight embrace. "I hate him," she whispered, "but I'm sad he's dead. Does that make sense?" "It makes perfect sense," he murmured, holding her close. "He was still your father." Later, she carefully placed the letter on the mantel, next to the daguerreotype of Mary and Sarah in the adoption papers. "It's part of my story," she said. "He gave me away, but that's what brought me to you. Maybe it was the only good thing he ever did, but it was enough." The next morning they went out into the fresh snow to hunt. As they walked, she slipped her small hand into his. "Papa," she said, "thank you." "For what?" "For seeing me that day in the saloon. For thinking I was worth $20. You were worth everything I had and more," he said gruffly. "You always were." They crested the last ridge, and their cabin came into view below, a thin curl of smoke rising from the chimney, a warm and welcoming sight. "Race you back!" Emma shouted, laughing as she took off through the snow. Ezra chased after her, his own laughter echoing off the peaks, a sound that would have been impossible for the broken man he used to be. But that man was gone, replaced by a father who had been saved by the love of a daughter. They tumbled through the door, breathless and happy, and in that moment, Ezra knew he was the richest man in the whole territory. He had found his family. He had found his home. Thank you for listening to this story of a family forged in the heart of the American frontier. If you enjoyed Ezra and Emma's journey, let us know where you're listening from in the comments below. We love hearing from fellow history lovers all around the world. And don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss another tale from the Old West. Your support helps us keep these incredible stories alive.